Imagine a world where you never have to choose between the cutting-edge packages of Arch, the stability of Debian, the source-based flexibility of Gentoo, or the minimalism of Alpine, because instead of picking one philosophy and living with its compromises, you can seamlessly combine them into a single cohesive system that behaves like it was designed that way from the start. And that vision is exactly what makes Bedrock Linux feel less like just another distribution and more like a fundamental rethinking of what a Linux operating system can be. Because while traditional distributions compete by curating their own repositories, package managers, and release models, Bedrock steps outside that paradigm entirely and asks a radical question. What if the distribution itself didn't matter anymore? What if the real power came from letting users mix and match the best parts of every ecosystem at the same time? And to understand why that idea is so powerful, you first have to remember that Linux itself, the kernel created by Linus Torvalds, was never meant to lock people into rigid environments, but rather to provide a flexible foundation that anyone could build upon. And over the decades, the community built countless distributions on top of that kernel, each solving problems in different ways, some prioritizing stability, others speed, others simplicity, others absolute control. And while this diversity is one of Linux's greatest strengths, it has always come with a hidden cost because choosing a distro often means giving up something you like from another one. And Bedrock Linux essentially removes that trade-off by acting as a meta-distribution that unifies them under a single system, allowing packages from multiple distros to coexist while sharing the same kernel and user environment, which sounds almost impossible at first because package conflicts, file system hierarchies, and dependency chains are notoriously incompatible across distributions. Yet Bedrock achieves this through a clever design that isolates each distribution into what it calls strata, lightweight environments that behave like their native systems, but integrate transparently so that applications can interact as if they were installed on one unified platform. And the result is a system where you might compile software using Gentoo's portage, install pre-built packages with Pacman from Arch, run Debian's stable services for reliability, and still pull niche tools from smaller ecosystems, all without rebooting into different installs or maintaining virtual machines. And this capability transforms the Linux experience from a matter of choosing one path to exploring all paths simultaneously, which is why many power users describe Bedrock not simply as flexible but as liberating, because it removes artificial boundaries that existed mostly due to historical packaging decisions rather than technical necessity. And when you start thinking about the implications, you realize it's not just about convenience but about redefining what control means in a computing environment. Since for decades, the promise of Linux has been user freedom, yet in practice that freedom was still framed within the confines of a single distribution's design philosophy, whereas Bedrock shifts the power balance entirely toward the user by letting them assemble their system like a toolkit instead of a pre-built product, and this modularity mirrors the original Unix philosophy of small components working together. Except now those components can come from entirely different distro lineages without friction, which is why Bedrock often feels like the logical evolution of the Linux ecosystem, rather than an outlier experiment, because instead of competing with other distributions, it leverages them, turning what used to be fragmentation into a resource. And from a technical standpoint, this is fascinating because the system manages path resolution, library access, and process visibility in a way that maintains compatibility while avoiding the overhead of virtualization, meaning performance remains essentially native. And that's a crucial point because many users previously relied on containers or virtual machines to access software from other ecosystems, but those solutions add complexity and resource costs, whereas Bedrock integrates everything directly into the host environment, so workflows remain smooth and fast. And this is where the idea of power becomes tangible because power in computing isn't just raw speed but the ability to adapt your system precisely to your needs without fighting against its design. And Bedrock excels here by letting developers choose the best toolchains from different worlds, letting sysadmins combine stable server components with bleeding-edge utilities, and letting enthusiasts experiment freely without reinstalling their OS every time they want to try something new. And beyond practicality, there's also a philosophical shift happening because Bedrock challenges the notion that distributions must be mutually exclusive identities, instead treating them as repositories of ideas and packages that can coexist, which subtly changes how we think about the Linux landscape as a whole, turning it from a collection of competing silos into a collaborative pool of innovation. And this perspective aligns closely with the spirit of the broader open source movement championed by organizations like the New Project, where the goal has always been to give users control over their computing rather than lock them into predetermined paths. And in that sense, Bedrock can be seen as an embodiment of that ethos taken to its logical extreme. Because it doesn't just give you source code or customization options, but gives you the freedom to redefine the very structure of your operating system. And as you dive deeper, you notice that the real magic isn't only in mixing packages, but in how seamlessly it works in everyday use. Because applications from different strata appear side by side in the same desktop environment, share the same home directory, and interact with the same system resources, making the experience feel coherent rather than stitched together. And this seamlessness is what turns Bedrock from a clever concept into a genuinely powerful platform. Because usability is what determines whether an idea remains theoretical or becomes transformative. And when users realize they can keep their familiar workflow while quietly benefiting from multiple ecosystems at once, the value becomes obvious, especially for people who have long wished they could combine. Say, Arch's rolling updates with Debian's rock-solid servers, or Alpine's lightweight containers with Ubuntu's vast package availability. And Bedrock makes those combinations not only possible but practical. Which is why many enthusiasts describe the first time they use it as a moment when the traditional distro boundaries suddenly feel arbitrary, almost like discovering that the walls between rooms in a house were never structural to begin with. And from a learning perspective, this environment is incredibly empowering because it encourages exploration, allowing users to compare package versions, experiment with different init systems, or test software across ecosystems without setting up separate installations, turning the operating system itself into a living laboratory. And this educational aspect shouldn't be underestimated because one of the greatest strengths of Linux has always been how it teaches users about how computers work. And Bedrock amplifies that by exposing the diversity of approaches in a single environment, making it easier to understand why distributions make the choices they do. And as you consider the broader impact, you start to see how this approach could influence the future of operating systems in general. Because the idea of composable systems where components are chosen independently rather than bundled into monolithic releases aligns with trends in software architecture like microservices and modular design, suggesting that Bedrock isn't just powerful for individual users but also conceptually ahead of its time. And of course, with great flexibility comes complexity, because managing multiple ecosystems requires a certain level of understanding. Yet this complexity is the same kind that power users have always embraced, the kind that turns a computer from a fixed appliance into a customizable instrument. And Bedrock's tools aim to keep that complexity manageable by providing clear commands for entering strata, installing packages, and controlling interactions, ensuring that while the system is incredibly capable, it doesn't become chaotic. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, you realize that what makes Bedrock feel like the most powerful Linux system isn't a single feature, but the cumulative effect of removing limitations that we've grown so used to. We barely notice them. Limitations like being tied to one package manager, one release cycle, one repository, or one philosophy, and by dissolving those boundaries, Bedrock turns Linux into something closer to a universal platform where the best ideas from every distribution can coexist, collaborate, and evolve together. And that's a profound shift because it reframes the conversation from which distro is best to how can we combine them to create something even better. And as more users experiment with this approach, it sparks new ways of thinking about system design, encouraging a mindset where flexibility and interoperability are the default rather than the exception. And ultimately, the reason Bedrock inspires such enthusiasm among those who discover it is that it delivers on the long-standing promise of Linux in a way few projects have, giving users not just choice but the ability to transcend choices altogether. And in a world where software ecosystems often try to lock people into predefined experiences, that kind of freedom feels genuinely revolutionary, making Bedrock Linux not just a powerful tool but a glimpse into what the future of open computing could look like. A future where your operating system isn't a single identity but a personalized synthesis of everything the Linux world has to offer, working together seamlessly to serve you rather than the other way around.